Migration is very much in the news these days. We might see images or even headlines like any of these. Most of news reports these days speak about a crisis. They refer to crowds of people, not individuals. While migration might be often in the news, it's nothing new at all. The UN defines a migrant as anyone who's living in a country other than where they were born. I would invite you right now to raise your hand if you're living in a country other than where you were born. Well, we see from the amount of hands raised that migration is also very common. Would you identify yourself as a migrant? Do others identify you as a migrant? Some of you maybe didn't raise your hand, or some of you might have a different experience. You might consider yourself Belgian, French, British, German, but people don't think that you fit that definition. People might constantly ask you, but where are you really from? Definition is a powerful thing. In times of fear and anxiety around migration, negative definitions emerge. When do you think the term illegal migrant first appeared? It wasn't recently, it was actually 1930. So behind all of these definitions, the reality, the humanity of migrants is often forgotten. One of my favorite teachers once said, "We study history so that we can learn to think critically about the present." I'd like to share with you a story from my own family's history that might help us to understand what are some of the current responses to migration and how migrants actually see themselves defined as migrants or not. My grandmother, Mary Flanagan, was born in Ireland in 1906. When she was 18 in 1924, she got on a boat and made a 9-day crossing to the United States. 6 years later, in 1930, her younger sister Mary also migrated. She was just 20. Mary wanted to join Margaret and their brothers in the United States. But at that time, only those who were healthy and who had a sponsor could gain official admittance to Ellis Island. Mary had tuberculosis. She had had it since when she was a child. She knew she would be refused entry to the United States and sent back to Ireland. So she took a boat and she went to Canada, where she knew no one, and settled in Montreal. A few years later, she was transported by car from Canada to the United States by Margaret. She crossed the border without the proper paperwork to live in the United States. I'd like to just ask you, when you hear the word irregular border crossing, what images come to mind? I often think migrants might be hiding. They might be in dangerous situations. So I immediately pictured my aunt in an irregular border crossing. Was she crouched down in the back seat? Was she hiding in the trunk? But as my dad recently told me, she sat up straight like a queen and was waved through immigration on the American side of the bridge without a stop. Recently, both in my work and watching the news, I find myself thinking more and more about Mary and Margaret, how time might have changed so completely and yet not at all. And I can't help thinking, if this was on today's news, my grandmother would be called or labeled a people smuggler. And if this was on today's news, my great aunt, who lived and worked in the United States for 30 years, might have been labeled an illegal migrant. My grandmother was one of 14 children. All but one emigrated to the United States or to the United Kingdom. Imagine all 13 children emigrated for good. Now, Mary and Margaret weren't fleeing conflict. The Irish Civil War was over by the time they were migrating. What they were fleeing was poverty. The year my grandmother migrated in 1924, the situation in the west of Ireland was particularly bleak. It was actually nearing famine. There was little opportunity on the farms and squalid conditions in the cities. Back then, and especially even now today, we often hear this term, economic migrants. It's commonly understood by that term that the main reason that people leave is to have a better life. But for Mary and Margaret and millions like them, it wasn't for a better life. It was actually even more basic. It was for survival. It wasn't a question of if they should leave, but how. Irish women migrated more than Irish men. They could easily find work abroad, as chambermaids, as cooks, as nannies, as cleaners. They were very reliable in sending money back to their families. Just like today, women make up half of all migrants worldwide, and migrant women continue to support entire families and entire communities with their earnings. In 2015, migrants sent more than $432 billion to developing countries, nearly 3 times the amount of all development aid. Mary and Margaret joined millions of migrant women arriving to the United States with probably very few skills. They might have been able to cook, to clean, maybe they knew enough to work in factories. They were non-educated, probably illiterate, and as Catholics, they were definitely the wrong religion. There was a lot of anxiety that too many migrants of the wrong religion might threaten democracy. While almost 100 years have passed, Mary and Margaret faced a similar situation to many migrants arriving in Europe today. I see them in the news reports of poverty of places like Ireland was 100 years ago. I see them in the packed boats arriving. For them, the journey obviously was very difficult. But for thousands of migrants nowadays who risk their lives because they don't have any other choice, the journey can be fatal. And I also see them in the anguish of families who might be separated for years, even decades. What do you think was on the top of the agenda in the United States in the 1920s? Nearly 100 years ago, anxieties were shaping the political response. Security, the economy, integrating millions of migrants arriving to the US. Those were the things on the top of the agenda. I find the parallels with the present day actually quite striking. If you think about it, security, the economy, and the integration of migrants are still key priorities for us in 2016. After World War I, the US was in a deep recession. Many people believed having more immigrants would just increase unemployment. So in 1924, the year my grandmother arrived, immigration laws were tightened. One senator claimed, "We need restrictions because Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jews arrived sick and starving and were therefore less capable of contributing to the American economy and unable to adapt to American culture." That's why when my Aunt Mary came in 1930, it was much more difficult. She had much fewer options to enter and live regularly in the country, so she became undocumented. And also, as I mentioned earlier, 1930 was the first time the term illegal migrant appeared. And today we see that this terminology still continues to shape policies and laws. Today, it's estimated that there might be up to 4 million undocumented migrants in Europe. If there's one word that I've constantly heard over many years of working on this issue about what most undocumented migrants face is fear. Living with irregular migration status means a constant fear of being detected and possibly deported. So recently, I've been thinking about my great Aunt Mary's experience. She was undocumented for 30 years. Did she ever panic when she saw a police car? Did she ever have a difficulty with her boss? Did he or she threaten to pay her less? Maybe not at all. What did she do when she got sick? Would she have gone to the hospital? Or maybe she might have been too afraid that the police would come or the hospital would report her to the immigration authorities. Did anyone ever call her illegal, as if being undocumented was a crime? When John F. Kennedy ran for president in 1960, my great Aunt Mary was so excited. Finally, an Irish-American candidate. But she was undocumented, so she couldn't vote. So she applied to become a US citizen so she could vote for him in a second term. He never got a second term, though, and it was obviously a very sad day in US history when he was assassinated in 1963. However, my great Aunt Mary did go on to vote in 6 presidential elections until she died in 1987. Despite having worked in this area of migration for many years, I never knew until recently that my aunt had been undocumented for 30 years. I never knew that she had been smuggled. In fact, none of our family did. No one ever saw her with that label. If there was anything Aunt Mary was known for in our family, it was being a savvy stock market investor. With the money that she earned over 30 years as an undocumented worker, she eventually invested a portfolio of $225 in the US stock market. It's about time. Migration is very much about time. Migration looks forward in time. It's hope. It's faith in the future. And migration is also about looking backward in time. It's a response to hopelessness and despair. Definitions and the power to define also change across time. We can't forget that terms that today we all find unacceptable were once used against women, people of color, people with disabilities, people who are LGBTI. But these terms were challenged and questioned until new words became the norm. Today, there's a growing movement to stop labeling migrants and migration as illegal. The Associated Press joins a whole list of those calling to stop using this term. Migration will always be a reality. Your children, your grandchildren, may one day be migrants. Shape that future. Feel empowered to challenge labels that aren't accurate, that segregate and divide us. Don't hesitate to speak up when your family, your neighbors, your colleagues, your elected officials use language that dehumanizes. History tells us that this is the only way that labels can and will change. Thank you.